So we've got a frame tool. Well, I'm not going to, it's really a placeholder sort of area for images if we're laying out a number of images on a page. Not something we're going to use at the moment, but the eyedropper tool can be useful. And we've got some additional tools around that type of tool. Let's stick with the eyedropper, because when we select that and we click in an area of colour, it will select that colour. Now you notice as soon as I've selected that, or as soon as I've clicked that area of colour, the colour has appeared in the colour picker, which is these two swatches of colour at the bottom of the, or near the bottom of the tool panel. So if I click that box, and let's just drag this into the screen so you can see it, you'll see we get the colour picker dialog box appear, and this is where we can select our colours. We've got CMYK colours, that's cyan, magenta, yellow and black, which we can put specific colours in for. We've got lab colours, we've got RGB colours, we've got other options as well for web safe colours. We can also pick a specific colour visually. So if we want to go for a lighter colour, we can move this around, and you see that the colour's changing in this box all the time. We can also move down the vertical picker or click in any one of those spots to select a different colour. And if I clicked add to swatches, which is quite a useful thing to do, we have a swatch panel down here, and it will just add that particular colour into our colour palette. In fact, let's just do that. We go OK, go to the swatches palette, and we can drag this out a little bit, and you'll see that colour has been added in to the swatches. Let's close that down. Eyedropper tool, I'm not going to go through all of these. We're not really going to be using those. We've got some healing tools, spot healing tools for working on smaller areas, healing, patch tools. We'll be coming on to using some of those tools later in the course, and you can see actually the patch tool is demonstrated in this little video clip. So it's a good way of repairing part of an image. The paintbrush tool I've dealt with to some extent. We've got other options for that, like a pencil tool, colour replacement, mixer brush tool. Let's stick with the brush tool, and let's have a look at how this works. So we've got a different colour selected than previously, so we're going to be drawing in green. Now let's just open our layers palette, because you'll notice we've only got one layer. So what I've just done would effectively destroy my calibration image. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to create a new layer. Let's call it line for the sake of argument, and click OK. I can actually double click in the text there and rename that layer if I want to. I might want to rename this layer, I often call background BG as a shortcut. Let's make sure we select the right layer. So we've got green selected as a colour, we've got the paintbrush tool selected, so we can draw a line, and we can now switch that on and off. But while we're doing that, let's look in the options strip, and we've got some things that apply to the paintbrush tool here. So to begin with, we've got no presets set at the moment, but we have got a way of controlling the size of the brush. So we can make it smaller. We can, let's bring it up again in size. We can, at the moment the hardness is set to 100%. If we reduce that down to 0, we then get a brush that is soft. And obviously we can choose any setting between 1 and 100 for that. We'll also have a number of presets for brushes, and we can scroll through those, and you might want to try out what some of those do. But you can actually also download free presets or paid for presets from the internet. You can search for those and download those, and they will appear in that list of presets. We just need to follow some instructions for how to load those. And again, because we're not really going to get it much into that on this course, I'm going to leave that for the moment. One other thing we'll look at, which I did mention earlier, is we've got an opacity on that layer. So we can reduce the opacity of these green lines to make them transparent. And as I said, we can play with the blending modes of how the two layers blend together. So you'll notice that at the moment, if it's set to normal, it's obscuring what's underneath. And the line with the soft edge obscures most of what's underneath except where the line begins to fade out. But if you look what happens when I set it to multiply, we can actually now see through that green line to what's below. And each one of these will have a slightly different effect. And of course, the sort of effect you're looking for will depend on the job that you're doing. And you've got lots of options there to try out. What else can we look at? I'm going to move on to, I think, the clone stamp tool, because that's going to be a very useful tool for this particular course. So let's remove what we've got on the screen. What I'm going to do is I've got the line layer selected, so I can go to my rectangular marquee tool, draw it over the lines that I've drawn, hit the delete button or key on the keyboard and delete those, and then Command D or Control D will deselect the area I've got selected. Now let's have a look at the clone tool, and to do that I'm going to open up a new image. So let me just browse for it, and we'll go for this one. Let's increase the size of that, just for a useful keyboard shortcut. To increase the size or decrease the size of an image quickly, you can use Command or Control on the keyboard and plus and minus. So, and if you get too large and you want to know where you are on an image, if we're going to see the pixels at that sort of size, but Command 0 will then fill the screen with that image. Let's take it down a bit so it's not too pixelated, because that is at 200% as we look at the tab there. So we've got the clone stamp tool. As you can see, it's quite a large brush size at the moment, which may not be very useful. My Bambina is this car that I've restored. It's decorated for Christmas in this image. I'm going to take the size of the brush down. I'm going to make sure, so I've opened a new file, so we've got one layer. So I'm going to create a new layer. And I've got that new layer selected. I've got my clone stamp tool selected. And I'm just going to look at the option strip, and you notice it says sample, current and below. Now that's referring to the layers. So it's going to sample an area wherever I click and drag, or wherever I click, I should say. And it's going to include what is on both layers. Well, actually there's nothing on the top layer at the moment, but let's see, what shall we do? If I clicked on this area of paving, this paving edging, and I'm going to hold the Option or the Option on a Mac, Alt key on a PC, hold that down, click the mouse once, and then release. Release my Option key, and you notice I can paint that edging in another place. Now what's actually happening, let me do that again and undo that. And I'm going to do a specific tutorial on how to use this tool effectively. So I won't spend too long on it, but let's just do that again. On a Mac, hold the Option key down. On a PC, hold the Alt key down. Click once with the mouse and release. And then click and drag somewhere else. And you'll notice that as I'm clicking and dragging, I'm still holding the mouse down. Back where I sampled, there's a crosshair. And that's picking up all that area and painting it in where I'm clicking and dragging. So I have to be careful what I go over, because whatever I go over where the crosshair is will be painted in the new area. Now let's undo that. That can be pretty useful for retouching photographs. For instance, if I reduce the size of the brush quite a bit, maybe even a bit more than that, you see this reflection in the door. If I pick up an area just away from it, hold the Option or the Alt key down, click once, and then start to paint, you see how I can retouch images. Now I've not made a great job of that, but we'll be doing quite a bit of that in this course. So retouching images, improving them, adding images together with other images. So that's the clone stamp tool, and as I said, there will be a specific tutorial on that which will go into more detail and will probably help you through a specific assignment. The history brush tool, we don't really get into much use in this course. The eraser tool might be useful at any point, just erasing something that you've done. And it works in a similar way to the brush tool in that you can select a brush size for it, and we can also select hardness. So if we've reduced the hardness completely, we're going to find that, let's just unlock the background, and in fact what I might do is select this empty layer and fill it with a colour, or fill it with white actually. If I go to Edit and Fill, and I don't want to choose the foreground colour because that's going to be green, I'm going to choose white and go OK, and that's filled this layer with white. Now of course it's obliterated my image, but it's on a separate layer, so I can change the order and put it in the background. And now if I go to my layer with the image on, and I've got the eraser tool selected, perhaps reduce the size a bit. So if I erase part of the image, that's now a hole in that image seeing through to the white. It may take a while for you to get your head around layers, but play with it and do this sort of thing to images and just see what happens. So let's undo that twice to get back to there. So that's the eraser tool. We've got some other options in there that I'm not going to cover on this video. We've got a gradient tool. Now that is useful for adding a number of different things, obviously gradients to areas, but we can apply different effects to gradients as well. And if with that tool selected, you'll notice again in the option strip, I have an example of how that gradient is looking currently. So you can see that green is selected because it's the foreground color. If I click on that gradient, you see I've got some control over how that actually looks. And at the moment, it's a gradient that goes from green to transparent. Now you can imagine that that might be useful for putting in a pale sky where it goes from a blue to a transparent. If you've got a sky that's got no kind of texture in it or anything and you want to add that into a sky. So with that layer selected, I would just click and drag. With that tool selected, I should say. And you see we've now got a gradient. Now I've applied that to the actual layer that the image is on. If I created a new layer above my car image and did the same thing, so that's now on a separate layer. I could play with the blending modes and see what that did to my image. It might be horrible. Some of those effects are, but there could be something that might be useful for what you're trying to achieve. So let's just switch that layer off for the moment. So that's a gradient tool. We've got a paint bucket tool, which if you've played with painting images online, you'll understand what that perhaps does in filling areas with colour. We have a blur and a sharpen and a smudge tool, and they do exactly what the name suggests. We can blur a specific area. Maybe we want to blur an edge or a line. We can do exactly the opposite of that and sharpen a specific area, or we can actually smudge an area. So if I go to my layer with the car on, we can move things around quite a bit, and that becomes almost like painting. We've got dodge and burn tools. Now we've got the dodge tool selected at the moment, and as you can see, that little video clip tells us that that's going to lighten an area, and we've got all the brush size controls as well. If we lightened an area, you can perhaps see that area in the window there is getting a bit lighter, and we can apply that to the shadow area, the midtones, and the highlights. So that might be useful for bringing some detail out of a certain area in your image. We can do exactly the opposite with the burn tool, and that will obviously darken an area. The pen tool, I'm going to do a specific video on how to use the pen tool. We've got quite a lot of options for the pen and what it does, and I use that quite a bit, particularly in Adobe Illustrator, but same tools in Photoshop. Quickly, I will say that if you click, you can create a shape, and as soon as you've created a shape, you can turn that into a selection in the Paths palette. Now let's just delete that, because also if you click and drag, you get what are called Bezier controls or handles, which enable you to create a curved shape. And again, you can do the same thing by applying a selection to that path that you created, and that happens in the Paths palette. Now there's quite a bit more you can do with the pen tool, and if you're trying to select an area and Photoshop won't do it automatically for you, you can do that manually by drawing around a shape. We have a type tool. Now if I use the type tool and click on the area, which I'm not going to do, but as soon as I click, it will create a layer and a cursor where I can start typing. And it's worth knowing that when you use the type tool, it creates something very similar to a vector file. Now a vector file is what Adobe Illustrator creates. In fact, let's just do it. Let's click, and it gives you some dummy text. This car is a Bambina, so let's type in Bambina, and it's given me the colour that's already selected. So notice when I select the type tool, it tells me what colour I'm going to be typing with. So if I want to change that, just click in that panel and select a different colour. But we'll stick with green. And so I can highlight that, and I've got a character palette is there. So that gives me control over fonts, bold, regular, italic, all that kind of stuff, point sizes and leading, which is the space between lines, and various other ways of controlling type. So that can be done while you've got that file as what we call a vector file or a vector image. Now we can change that layer. You see it looks a bit different to the other layers. It's given me the actual type that I've typed as a name. I can go up into the layer menu and choose rasterize type. And now I won't be able to edit that as type anymore because it's now seeing it as an image rather than as a vector. So I could choose the smudge tool and smudge that text. So that's kind of a graphic sort of approach to Photoshop, I guess. Let's turn that layer off. So there are some graphic design sort of tools in here as well. Moving through, we've got path selection and a direct selection tool. Now that tool is useful when we've drawn a path using the pen tool. We can edit it. Let's just demonstrate that. So if we've got the path, then we go to our selection tool. The direct selection tool, if I click away from the path and then select it again, you'll see that this is all editable now, where the anchor points are. And I can move them around and I can do that kind of thing. So we've also got the path selection tool, selects the whole path. So if you want to edit an element of it, just click away. Make sure you're on the white tool, which is the direct selection arrowhead. Click the path and you can then edit it individually at the anchor points. We've got a shape drawing tool, all those shapes if you need them. And one other thing to say on the shape tool is that it also works a bit like the type tool in that it draws a shape, and if we look at the layer palette, it's creating a vector file from that shape. So we might want to at some stage rasterize that if we needed to edit it drastically. Let's just turn that off. The hand tool is very useful because we might need to, particularly when we've got our image blown up large, we might need to move around. Now, really the better way of doing this is you can be on any tool, and if you hold the space bar down, you get the hand tool. So if you're needing to move around your image quickly, just hold the space bar down and the hand tool will appear and you can click and drag. We've got a magnifying glass tool which if you can reduce and enlarge that way. And I've mentioned the colour picker down the bottom. So that, I think we're going to leave it there. Now I've just closed down the other image and opened up again the screen calibration image. And I want to talk about two things. One is saving your work and the other is resizing your work to the requirements to upload to Blackboard. Now, please, please, please save your work regularly. I tend to save my work as soon as I start. Even if I have a blank page, I'll save my work. The reason for that is that it enables me to set up a folder structure and save my new file to that folder. And then it enables me to use a keyboard shortcut to save as I'm editing. So once I've saved it once, I can do my next edit. If I'm happy with that edit, I'll save that by using a keyboard shortcut, and on a Mac it's Command S. On a PC it's Control S. So get used to using that keyboard shortcut and let it become an automatic thing. You make an edit you're happy with, save it. The worst thing is to work on a file for a long time without having saved your work, and then something causes a crash perhaps, and you can't get back to where you were and you lose your work. Don't work for hours on a file and let that happen. Regularly save your work. If you worked on it for 5 or 10 minutes or longer, it's too long if you haven't saved. So the next thing is to say, how do we save our work? Well, as you see, I've got the layers palette open, and we may well have quite a complex file with lots of layers. We've done lots of edits. Now we want to save all those different edits. So we're going to go up to File and Save As. And if we've done this at the start of the of our editing, then we've already got our file structure set up, and we're doing this automatically on our keyboard using Command S or Control S. But the first time we come to do it, we'll want to make sure we set it up as a Photoshop format. The reason being that that is Photoshop's native format, and that is the format that will save all the layers that we've got in our file. So we'll go to save, and I'm just going to save this, I think, on the desktop for now. I've called it calibration. Let's put a 1 in there in case there's another file I have called that. So, and you can see that we've got a PSD file, that's the Photoshop format, and that will save the layers. So we'll save, and that's now saved on my desktop, and it's saved with these layers intact. But we want to save it again. Now, the reason being that this is going to become our master file. If we need to go back into it and do further editing, we always go back to our master file. This will be the largest file, the file with the largest or highest resolution. It's something that we haven't reduced in size. It's the maximum quality. And we want to go back to that file, the master file, the .psd file, if we want to re-edit this file. And in that instance, we'll then save it again as a .psd file. But then we're going to reduce our layers down to 1. In the layers palette, we can do that by going to flatten image in the layers palette menu. So we choose that, and you'll see that the layers become 1 layer, a background layer again. And this is going to be, this is where we're going to resize our image. So before we save it, we're going to resize our image, because Blackboard requires that we size images to a specific size, and you'll find details of that in the week 1 study guide. It gives you details of the exact size you need to reduce your file to, or your image to, and also the exact name you have to give it, because there's a protocol for naming your files. You'll find that in the week 1 study guide, and I will be just checking on that in the first week that you get that correct. So we've flattened our image. We're then going to resize it, and getting the order of this is important. So master file first, saved as a PSD, then flatten your image down to 1 layer, then resize. So we're going to go to image size, and this box gives us all the details of how large our image is. So this calibration screen image measures 3373 pixels wide. And we can change the units if we want. We can see what it is in millimeters, but we're going to stick to pixels. And it's important that we have this resample box checked as well. It's also important that the two dimensions, the width and the height, are linked, because when we change one, the other one will then change in proportion. We can unlink those by clicking this chain icon. So if you see that on your screen without those lines linking the two measurements, just click on that icon again so that you reveal those. Then it will change in proportion. The first thing we're going to change is the resolution. And you'll notice when we change the resolution, the dimensions change as well. So we're going to change the resolution to 72. So that brings the size down to 1600 pixels. And then we're going to change the dimensions to 1500. Now, Blackboard requires that all your images are 1500 pixels on the longest edge. Now, the reason we say the longest edge is because if it's a landscape image, as this calibration image is, so it's wider than it is tall, it's a landscape image, then the width is going to be the longest edge, and that needs to be 1500. If you're working on a portrait image, then the height will be the longest edge because it's taller than it is wide, so you'll need to change the height to 1500 and the width will be less than 1500. So make sure you get the right dimension, width or height, depending on whether you're working on a landscape or a portrait image. So we've now set the resolution to 72 pixels per inch. We've set the dimensions to 1500 on the longest edge. So we can click OK, and the image is reduced down to that size. Now here is where we want to save it again. We can go to File, Save As. So our image is the right size for Blackboard, and just decide where you're going to save your file. Change the format to JPEG. So previously it was a .psd with all the layers. We flattened the image to one layer, and we're saving this as a JPEG, which will mean that we have two files. We have a master file, as I've mentioned before, which is the maximum resolution and physical size. This one we've resized and we're going to save as a JPEG. And the last thing we want to do is think about what we're going to call the file. And the reason that we want to think about that carefully is because SIT has a naming convention for its files. And this is because facilitators receive so many files that you need to be able to name these files correctly. And there's details of this in the Week 1 study guide. But you need to start the file name with the name of your paper. Now that can either be NZDP101 or simply 101 will be okay, but let's put the full title, NZDP101, that's this paper, then a hyphen, and then we're going to identify the week we're working on. So let's start with week 1, so we might put WK for week and week 1. Now on week 1 there are two images to do. So when there's a week where there are multiple images, you might want to identify each image perhaps by an A, B, C, etc. So this we'll call week 1A. And lastly, another hyphen, and then your name, and it's surname first and then first name. So I'm going to put my surname, which is Garman Tim. So that is how the file name should look. Your paper, which week you're working on, the exact image it is, and your name. So we can then go to save. And lastly, you will just get this JPEG quality box. Just make sure that the quality is on maximum and set to 12, and then you can go OK. So that has now saved a second file. So you've got your master file, which is a PSD, and your JPEG reduced down, ready for uploading to Blackboard.